Every tabletop RPG is a different experience. As I always say, they're like tools in your toolbox. Systems like Pathfinder are that complex tool used for more tactical, crunchy experiences. Games like Fate and Powered by the Apocalypse are those simpler and more streamlined tools for something very loose and narrative. Finally, there are a couple of systems that are kind of a happy midpoint, allowing a streamlined narrative flow and a multitude of options and rules you can rely on. The Cypher System is one such tool. Its core is streamlined and simple, with the mechanics needed to give both players and game masters ways to affect the narrative. This means you have toys to let you balance things on the fly, and never have to worry about those "oh shit" moments like in D&D, where you planned an encounter and then it turns out too easy, hard, etc. Cypher gives everyone the tools to guide this, while still having the structure to be a good solid game. On top of the streamlined core system mechanics, you also have an expansive list of options and adjustable dials. This lets you fine-tune your specific campaign to your playstyle. It can be anything from ultra-light narrative using only theater of the mind descriptions and needing no extras, to crunchy and tactical with battle maps, minis, measures, and a whole shebang. But wait, there's more! The Cypher System started out as the core system for an RPG called Numenera. It was then used for some other RPGs by Monte Cook Games like The Strange, before they decided to finally make it into a setting-agnostic universal system that could be used for anything. Since then, the content has exploded. Led by Monte Cook, a very well-known name in the industry, the company, Monte Cook Games, employs an extremely talented and experienced group of writers, designers, artists, business minds, logistics, and more. There are a ton of specific settings you can play in, as well as expansion books that provide content for genres like sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, fairy tales, post-apocalyptic, and more. To make things even better, Monte Cook Games has had a creator program for a significant amount of time, and in July of 2022, introduced a very straightforward open license for anyone to use without any hassles. This video is going to be about the core of the system. I will not be going over extras from the expansion or setting books or any third-party material, etc. If you prefer shorter form content, the rest of the series that I have here does sort of mini deep dives on each section of the system in 5 to 10 minute chunks. However, a number of people have asked for a solid, long-form content video on the system, so here it is. I will say I am splitting this video into two parts. The first one focuses on how characters and the basic core mechanics work, and the second will expand into more advanced topics, tips for playing, and cover basically anything else we missed in part 1. Now, let's give her, eh? The first thing I want to mention is pretty basic knowledge to anyone experienced with tabletop role-playing games, but if you're new to this, the Cypher System uses polyhedral dice, similar to games like Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder. The most common polyhedral dice sets come with dice that range from 4-sided to 20-sided, with the 10-sided dice used twice to make the 10s and 1 digits for percentile or D100s. Dice codes are very standard, referring to the number of dice, then the letter D to let you know that it's dice, and then the size of the die, and then any modifiers. So 2d6 plus 3 means you roll 2 6-sided dice and add 3 to the total. Cypher doesn't usually make much use of the D4s, D8s, or D12s, and instead focuses on the D6s, D10s, and D20s. I think I have also seen some use for the D3, which is just a D6 divided by 2. Before I go through each part of the system and explain it, what I can do is explain to you the few easy steps for how the vast majority of the game is played. I'm going to break this down into 6 easy steps. Step 1. Declare what you want to do. Let the GM know what your intended goal is, how you plan to achieve it, any narration to go along with whatever actions you're taking. Just basically describe what you would like to do. This ends up being known as your task or the task. Step 2. If your intended task has a chance of failure or something interesting may happen upon that failure, the GM will ask for a task roll. and declare if it is a might, speed, or intellect-based task. They will also determine the difficulty on a scale of 1 to 10. Step 3. The GM and yourself determine if there are any modifiers to the difficulty. These can come from multiple sources, such as skill training, abilities, level of effort, situational and environmental modifiers, and more. Anything that eases the task causes the difficulty to lower by that many steps. Anything that hinders the task causes the difficulty to raise by that many steps. If the difficulty is lowered to 0, then the task just succeeds automatically. In regular Cypher, difficulties cannot reach higher than 10. Step 4. You and the GM determine the cost for your task, if there is any. This could come from multiple areas, like abilities, applying effort, or even an upfront cost the GM gave you because of the task being extra taxing or extreme. You total that cost up, lowered by your edge in the might, speed, or intellect pool this task is based on, and if there's any cost left over, this is deducted from that same pool. Step 5. Assuming the difficulty is at least 1, then the GM multiplies the new modified difficulty by 3 to get your target number. And finally, step 6. Since the players make all of the rolls in the system, it is now up to you, the player, to roll the 20-sided die. If you roll the target number or greater, your task succeeds. If the task fails, don't worry, you may still have options, which we'll get into later. That's it. That is the core of the system in a nutshell. There are other bits to learn that can let you guide it and use it to your benefit. However, when we really get to it, this is the basics of how the system works. The beauty of the fact that it's just a task roll, whether you're stabbing a goblin in the nose or convincing a mega corporation to give you a job, this means you can be creative with how you achieve your goals. It's not like many RPGs that have different types of roles or sub-mechanics for different types of actions. Now, let's start by going over each part of the character sheet, and we'll explain what it's used for and how it works. For this video, I will be referencing old Gus's character sheets that you can find on his system reference document website for Cypher, but honestly, I've used everything from a virtual tabletop to a pencil and a napkin to play this game. As long as you have somewhere for maybe a couple of numbers to remember, that's all you really need. After we have gone through all of the parts of the character sheets, any topics I haven't covered will then be added onto the end of the video. Let's start with what is possibly the most important part of your character, the character sentence. In the Cypher system, each character is described with a simple sentence that roughly goes like this. Name is a descriptor, type, who, focus. Although depending on the specifics of your setting, there may be optional parts added or removed from the sentence, like species descriptors or flavors. The descriptor of a character is usually the personality or some physical expression of that character. It's often something like charming, fast, hideous, mad, stealthy, vicious, and so on. This not only gives you some mechanical adjustments, which we'll discuss in more detail later in the video, but may help guide you when role-playing that character and even provide links to the group within the campaign. The type of a character is the foundational core of what your character can do. In the main Cypher system, this is usually Adept, Explorer, Speaker, and Warrior. Although once again, depending on the setting and setup of your campaign, these may be adjusted or even outright replaced with other types. What you choose will affect many of your other core character mechanics, like your pools, edge, cipher limits, equipment, and the bulk of your abilities. The focus of your character is a specialized set of extras that you gain as you advance. These are usually fairly specific and represent what you're really good at. It could be things like builds robots, commands mental powers, howls at the moon, interprets the law, play too many games, uses wild magic, and so much more. Deciding on all of these parts of your character sentence is what shapes the foundation of who you are playing. But that doesn't always mean it's as restrictive as a game like Dungeons & Dragons and choosing their classes, since there are ways in this book to swap out or even alter abilities and other aspects of these choices. It really helps you to customize what you can do. This is also often the part where many players kind of feel overwhelmed in the Cypher system if you're in a campaign where you're basically given carte blanche. Between the expansion books, the other setting books, and so on, the number of choices you have is pretty intense. But don't worry, it doesn't have to be. And I'll be discussing this in the companion video to this one when we discuss about GMs and campaign setup. When you undertake a task, one of the ways you as a player can try to influence that task is by applying levels of effort. This part in your character sheet shows you the maximum levels of effort that you can apply to a single task. So, what is effort? After you have declared the task you wish to undertake, you can also declare if you apply one or more levels of effort, up to the maximum of your effort score. Each level of effort is chosen from one of the following options. To ease the task. Each level of effort applied in this area eases the task, lowering the difficulty of that task by one step. Extra damage. If the task is something that would cause damage, each level of effort applied here increases the damage of that task. For most attacks, this would be +3 damage per effort applied in this way. However, other effects may have other damage values, such as an area of effect style explosion, which generally only adds +2 damage per effort applied. Other. This has no set mechanics to it, but rather ties into certain abilities that have options when applying effort. Some abilities may allow for more targets, longer duration, extra effects, and more, depending on the effort you spend for those uses. You'll find those in the descriptions of each ability. You can mix and match the levels of effort as you see fit. For example, you're slashing at an ogre with your sword and decide you are applying 3 levels of effort. You know the ogre isn't too difficult to hit, so you're going to apply only one of those levels of effort to ease the task, just to make it a little easier. But you also know it has a durable, thick hide, so you're going to apply 2 levels of effort on damage. Make sure it gets through its natural armor. Sounds great, right? Why wouldn't you do this on every task? Well, I mentioned previously that a task may have a total cost with it, and effort is part of that cost. The first level of effort applied on a task adds 3 points to the cost of that task, with each level of effort after that first one adding a further 2 points to the cost. So a single level of effort would cost you 3 on that attack, but 3 levels of effort would add 7 to the total cost of that task. So be careful when applying effort. It can really help you shape the flow of the game as a wonderful narrative tool as a player. However, if you're not careful, you can basically drain yourself to nothing by being too much of an awesome badass all the time. A side note here as well. In the rules, it states that if you are attempting to retry a failed task, like unlocking the airlock door that you just failed to open, that this is an entirely new task, and you must apply at least 1 level of effort on that task roll. This has proven to be a little confusing by some people the first time they read it, because this does not mean the level of effort sole use is the retry. The effort can be used for anything. It just means that you had to apply a level of effort for something on that retry task roll. Doesn't matter what. So you could retry to open that door and apply a level of effort to ease the task to meet the retry requirements. Retries don't apply to something like attacking a foe in combat, because that's considered an always changing and fluid situation. So they aren't actually retries, they're new tasks each time. Alright. I'm actually going to leave tier, XP, and advancement until the end of our character sheet overview, so let's pass on those. Every character has recovery rolls to allow them to recover points to their pools over time. Although character options can affect these, by default each character's recovery rolls are 1d6 plus their tier. So a tier 4 character recovers 1d6 plus 4 per recovery roll by default. How long it takes to use your recovery rolls depend on how many times you've rolled them recently. The first recovery roll only takes 1 action to use, with the second one taking 10 minutes, then 1 hour, and finally 10 hours. After that final recovery roll, it's assumed you'll be starting a new day before you can start the whole process over again. So if you were a tier 1 character and spent an entire day resting and recovering, you could regain 46 plus 4 points from your 4 recovery rolls. The amount you roll can be spread among your pools as you see fit. They do not have to be in an individual pool per roll. Also, there are character and advancement options that will adjust your number of recovery rolls or bonuses to them. This can very much be dependent on what choices you make. I would also like to note here that recovery rolls are not the only way to recover points to your pools. Cyphers, artifacts, and abilities can also recover points. Also, other characters can attempt the healing action on you once per day to help you recover points as well. The Dmg Track. This is the closest thing to an actual health indicator we get in Cypher. By default, your character is what's known as hale, which in this case just means you're healthy and without issues. The next step down the damage track is impaired, which has the effect of increasing the cost of applying effort by 1 additional point per level of effort. You also ignore any major or minor effects for rolling high on your task rolls, and you cannot get more than 1 bonus damage from high rolls for attacks. We'll go over what those special rolls mean later. After impaired comes debilitated. You can no longer take any actions except to move an immediate distance, probably by crawling or barely limping. However, if your speed pool is at 0 as part of this, then you can't even move. You just remain basically helpless in a daze. Finally, if you move beyond debilitated on the damage track, you're dead. There are a couple of things that can lower you down to the damage track. Each time a pool is brought to 0, you are brought 1 step down it. Also, certain effects, NPC abilities, GM intrusions, and so on could theoretically move you down the damage track directly as well. If a pool that is at 0 is brought to at least 1, then you move back up the damage track by 1 step. If you are moved down the damage track directly by an effect or intrusion, then the GM will let you know what you need to do to move back up, just in case. It likely involves some sort of extended rest, medical attention, magic, or something else. You can gain your abilities from your type, descriptor, focus, flavor, or even sometimes earn them as in-game as rewards. There are many ways you can gain abilities. Most abilities are quite straightforward. Firstly, they have their name, which would be unique for that particular ability. Then the ability will state if it has a pool point cost to activate. If there is a task roll needed for the ability, this cost is added on to the total cost of that task roll. In very, very rare circumstances, instead of a pool point cost, you may see an experience point cost, but this is very rare and few and far between. Then comes the description to tell you what the ability actually does. Finally, at the end of the ability, it will likely tell you if it is an action, which means it's an action to complete and resolves immediately, an action to initiate, which means it takes an action to do but will last for a longer period of time after it's complete, or an enabler, which does not require an action. Enablers are often either completely passive abilities that have modified your character in some way, or something you can use at basically any time, even if it's not your turn, or in conjunction with other abilities. There may be other specific circumstances, like maybe 10 minutes to complete the action to initiate it, and then it lasts an hour or something funky like that. Either way, it always tells you in the description of the ability, so it's nice and easy, you just have to read it. Abilities come in all styles of complexity. Some are a single sentence with a straightforward bonus. Some are long, complicated descriptions with a subtable and a variety of uses. Don't worry, each ability will tell you exactly how to use it, just read it carefully. I will note, generally abilities cannot draw from multiple pools at once. If an ability says it has a might cost associated with it, any task rolls will also generally be might based for the purpose of things like effort. I'm sure there are exceptions, but when it comes to something as complex as an RPG, there are always exceptions, right? By default, each character has 3 pools: might, speed, and intellect. And as is always true with Cypher, certain settings or campaigns may have additional pools as well, but for now, let's stick to the basics. Here are the descriptions as pulled from the free-to-use OG system reference document. Might defines how strong and durable your character is. The concepts of strength, endurance, constitution, hardiness, and physical prowess are all folded into this one stat. Might governs actions from forcing doors open to walking for days without food, to resisting disease, and many aspects of physical combat. Speed describes how fast and physically coordinated your character is. The stat embodies quickness, movement, dexterity, and reflexes. Speed governs such divergent actions as dodging attacks, sneaking around quietly, and throwing a ball accurately. It even helps to determine whether you can move further on your turn. Nimble, fast, or sneaky characters will want good speed stats, as will those interested in ranged combat. Intellect. This stat determines how smart, knowledgeable, and likable your character is. It includes intelligence, wisdom, charisma, education, reasoning, wit, willpower, and charm. Intellect governs solving puzzles, remembering facts, telling convincing lies, and basically using any mental check. Characters interested in communicating effectively, being learned scholars, or wielding supernatural powers should really stress their intellect stat. Each stat pool also has an associated edge score with it. Edge lowers any total incoming cost from tasks and abilities. One important note I'd like to make for players new to this system from a system like D&D or Pathfinder, these pools are not your health. In fact, Cypher doesn't really have a health score or hit points of any kind. It does have the damage track, which we mentioned, but it does not have any sort of point value to represent your health. Instead, these pools represent how much presence or impact you have left in the scene in those particular areas. Your pools are just a way to represent how much energy you have to apply to a particular style of tasks and abilities. Once the pools are depleted, then you may start to see some impact to your health by taking steps down the damage track. I only say this because I've seen many new players coming from those systems that feel frustrated when they think they have to hurt themselves to apply effort or activate abilities because they're assuming the pools are like your hit points that you'd find in other systems. In the Cypher system, worn armor works as a form of damage mitigation, rather than adjusting the likelihood of a successful attack. Shields, however, do make it harder to attack you as they're used to outright block or deflect the attack. Shields work very simply by applying an asset to any speed defense rolls you make to defend against an attack. All characters are able to use a shield without issues or penalty as long as they have a hand free to hold it. Armor works a little differently. Every set of armor has two numbers to it. Its armor rating, which is the amount it reduces incoming damage by, and a speed cost. That is the number that is added to the cost for each level of effort you apply on a speed task. So if you're wearing light armor with a speed cost of 1 and you apply 2 levels of effort, that means the cost for the effort would cost 7 instead of 5. 3 for the first level of effort, plus 2 for the second level of effort, plus 2 for wearing the light armor because of the 1 per level of effort. Like weapons, armor is split into light, medium, and heavy, which each can have an armor rating to it. If you're practicing the armor, your speed cost is likely the default. However, there are varying levels of experience armor that can adjust the speed cost as you see from this table. By default, all characters are considered practiced in most things. Although you may find all sorts of special weapons or attacks from abilities and so on, the vast majority of the system attacks really break down into 3 types. Light attacks do 2 damage and are eased, which lowers the difficulty of attacking with them by 1 step. Medium attacks do 4 damage and are not eased like light attacks. And heavy attacks do 6 damage and require 2 hands to use usually. If the attack has a range to it, usually something from like a Cypher, ability, equipment, etc., then the range is stated in its description. There are other types of attacks, like area of effect attacks, for example, that often have different damage amounts, a minimum damage received, and adjustments to effort when applying extra damage. This is usually in the description of whatever is supplying that attack. By default, unarmed attacks like punches and kicks are often just light attacks. By making the vast majority of attacks light, medium, or heavy, it makes it very easy to improvise weapons as they're needed. You don't need to come up with detailed stats for a table leg that the warrior just ripped off to beat someone with. Just call it a medium weapon and you're good. Keep in mind that your character's type may have set your training in certain types of weapons, with some types having inabilities in one or more of them. If you're coming from another RPG system, then this part may be a bit of a surprise for you, because there's no set skill list in the Cypher system. This is partly because, as a universal system, it needs to handle everything from the most ancient of fantasy to the most futuristic of sci-fi, but also because you can be skillful in almost anything, from a general area of expertise to a hyper-specialized talent. By default, you gain skills from your character options. Descriptor, type, and focus may provide this directly or through abilities with modifications to them. Skills can be more open and general, like social interactions, or narrow and specific, like electronic locks used by the Megatech Corporation. Although they're called skills, you can technically adjust how good you are in just about any type of task in the game, from your various abilities to combat defenses, initiative, and more. If there is something in the game you can make a task roll for, you can probably get training in it. By default, your character is considered practiced in every task. No penalties or bonuses of any kind. However, as you fill out your options and abilities, there may be certain adjustments to these. If you have an inability in something, all associated tasks with that are hindered, meaning the difficulty is increased by 1. An example of this is the tongue-tied descriptor. Because of your nature of having a hard time expressing yourself, it states all tasks involving verbal communication or relaying information are hindered. Skills can also be trained, which eases a task by 1 step, thus lowering the difficulty by 1. Or specialized, which eases the task by 2 steps, lowering the difficulty by 2. The amount of training you have in a skill can also adjust how well you can help someone, which you can find in the actions list. Cyphers are kind of a big deal. After all, this is called the Cypher System for a reason. Cyphers are like one-use character abilities. As a player, you are constantly cycling through new ones, so don't be afraid to use them, you will find more. First, let's look at what's on your character sheet, then I'll explain a little bit more about them. You'll notice there's really only 2 parts in the sheet, your limit and a place to write some ciphers down. Each character has a limit on the number of ciphers they normally have, based on their type and any abilities they may have to expand this. So if you're an adept with a cipher limit of 3, that means you can safely have that many ciphers at one time. By default, if a character ever attempts to carry more ciphers than they currently have, other randomly determined ciphers will disappear until they're back down to their limit. Manifest ciphers break or are lost. Subtle ciphers just vanish. It does state in the rules that it's not unreasonable for a character to have a manifest cipher stashed away somewhere in case of an emergency. Some settings may deal with ciphers a little differently. Numenera, for example, still limits you for subtle ciphers, but does technically allow you to have as many manifest ciphers as you'd like. However, for every cipher over your limit, there is a greater and greater chance that something catastrophic occurs. From all the ciphers breaking to maybe even exploding or developing into some sort of dimension-hopping singularity. In a cyberpunk campaign a friend of mine ran for me, he actually had the idea that since most of the ciphers in this particular campaign were weapons or illegal drugs, that the ciphers over the normal limit would bring down the heat of law enforcement. After all, if you hoard a bunch of drugs and explosives in your van, the fuzz may very well catch on to it. Cipher will often come in one of 2 types, manifest or subtle. And each of those may also have an additional sort of subtype, like fantastic or power boost cipher. Let's start with manifest ciphers. This means it is a physical object of some kind. What sort of physical object it has can change depending on the genre you're playing in. It could be a magical scroll, alien technology, injectable drug, throwable explosion, psychic crystal, and so much more. Subtle ciphers have no physical representation. They're things like moments of inspiration, psychic effects, divine blessings, random luck, alien concepts, supernatural powers, magical gifts, and other abstract concepts. Fantastic ciphers are manifest or subtle ciphers that have some sort of fantastical effect that would put them out of place in a more basic world setting. A drug that boosts your speed would be a manifest cipher, but a scroll that summons a demon would very much be a fantastic manifest cipher. Finally, there are power boosters. Normally using a cipher takes an action to activate. These ciphers are used in conjunction with your character abilities to modify or improve them. Power boosters can be manifest or subtle. So, how do we gain manifest ciphers? Manifest ciphers could be rewards, found, traded, bought, crafted, or even scavenged. These ciphers often randomly generated to add a little bit of uncertainty, but I also know plenty of GMs that have curated lists or even just pick and choose which ones the players will find. A player may request to search for manifest ciphers. If the GM agrees, it requires a task roll with a difficulty usually of around 3 or 4 and takes about 15 minutes to an hour. Manifest ciphers, whether searched for by players or dropped in the world by the GM, are usually found in groups of 1d6. The default rules say that manifest ciphers are not necessarily identified when you first get them, requiring an intellect task to figure out what they are, usually with a low difficulty, like 1 or 2. This means that even a small amount of information about them would ease it into the automatic success territory. This identification process takes about 1 to 10 minutes. Alright, when you generate manifest ciphers, you will likely need to roll for the level of that cipher, something like 1d6 plus 2. The exact roll will be listed in the description of the cipher. Well, that was manifest. How do we gain subtle ciphers? Well, subtle ciphers are a little different because of their abstract nature. How subtle ciphers are generated is something the GM and the group needs to think of before the game, as there may be certain times, situations, or triggering effects that allow players to generate these subtle ciphers. It's suggested, except in certain circumstances, that subtle ciphers generally should not be easily generated via actions under the player's control. Instead, it's a suggestion in the rules that the GM should award them during significant moments or when it makes sense. Maybe upon discovering where the hostage is hidden, the characters feel inspired and gain some subtle ciphers. Or the characters intercept an alien transmission, the resulting strange knowledge seeping into their mind in the form of a subtle cipher. Like manifest ciphers, subtle ciphers are found in groups of 1d6. The GM may automatically assign them to certain players or not, depending on the agreements at the table. Subtle ciphers never have to be identified. The characters always know what they do. There are times when your group may decide that subtle ciphers can be granted, like a divine blessing from the altar of your deity that you just prayed at, or a supernatural gift from a demon after making a deal. Like manifest ciphers, when generated, you need to roll for their level. The exact roll will be in the listing of that cipher. Although characters can't search for subtle ciphers, a player may spend 1 experience point as a player intrusion to gain a subtle cipher. A player can either ask for the cipher to be of a general category like healing, movement, defense, etc. Or you may attempt to gain a specific subtle cipher by making an intellect task with a difficulty equal to 1 plus the cipher's level. The task is eased if you have had this cipher before. If you fail the intellect task, you don't gain the cipher, and the experience point is spent anyways. Using ciphers. A cipher is generally an action to use. The exceptions are power booster ciphers or ciphers that say otherwise in their descriptions. By default, using ciphers is based on intellect unless it makes more sense to use something else, like speed for a detonation cipher. It's a sort of grenade, for example. If a cipher has an effect that continues, it remains on the person who activated it. You cannot transfer the effect to someone else. A cipher does not always require a roll as part of its use. If the GM thinks it makes sense, or if the cipher would be directly opposed by the level of something or someone, like if it was a laser beam attack or shuts down a local computer system, then a task roll may be required. Otherwise, the cipher just works. There is an optional rule presented in the Cypher System called Normal Ciphers Duplicating Fantastic Effects. TLDR is that if your group is willing to stretch your imaginations a little, there's nothing to say that many of the more fantastical ciphers can't be explained away in a mundane environment. A singularity detonation may have just been a vacuum-sealed gas canister. A inferno wall may have just been a sprayed line of napalm. This won't work with everything, and you may have to take it on a case-by-case basis, but the system is all about being creative in the moment. And finally, there are a ton of ciphers. Many of the books by Monte Cook Games has some printed inside, and you can buy literal card decks of ciphers from their store and DriveThruRPG. There are a ton of third-party materials with ciphers as well. One of the handiest collection of third-party ciphers I've personally used is the subtle ciphers based off TV tropes written by Andreas Walters, Andrew Montgomery Hurl, and Michael Berry. The Cypher System is not a very equipment-dependent game. Honestly, unless a piece of equipment has a particularly important use or is quite costly in some way, it's not unreasonable for you to just be able to say you have access to fairly regular items. This, of course, can change depending on the style of game you're playing. A well-off modern detective story likely means you have a much greater access to the stuff you want over, say, a post-apocalyptic survival campaign. In a high fantasy adventure, you're legendary heroes, and it doesn't make sense to track how many days rations you have. But when you're a 1930s mobster that's hunting werewolves, it could be pretty important to know how many silver bullets you have left. Thus, the equipment section may see a varied amount of use depending on the game. Within the equipment section, you'll also see categories from inexpensive to exorbitant, and a money section. This is because there are two ways to handle wealth in Cypher. You can either categorize everything into one of 5 wealth categories, or use a currency system of some kind. Equipment found through the rules usually has things listed with both the cost and category depending on what your table is using. Artifacts are not something you're likely to see often. They're sort of a cross between equipment and a cipher in many ways. Artifacts are super special items that go above and beyond what a normal piece of equipment, weapon, or armor could do. Artifacts are usually something rare, like a powerful magical item, alien technology, ancient primordial crystals, and so much more. Each artifact has a description of whatever it can do that is special. Every artifact is quite different and unique, so read the description carefully. Each artifact also has a depletion roll, although some artifacts just have a depletion of none and last forever. But many of the artifacts have a rating for their depletion, something like 1 in 1d6, which means if you roll a 1d6 and on a result of 1, it depletes. Or maybe a 1 to 7 and a 1d100, which means you roll a percentile or 1d100 and on a result of 1 to 7, it depletes. Depletion means the artifact ceases to work. There are some uncommon abilities and methods in the game to get a depleted artifact to work again. However, otherwise, a depleted artifact is basically just a very shiny paperweight. I think this is great because it solves a very real issues you see in games like D&D and Pathfinder with permanent special items. As a GM, there have been many times I've given something to players that we find out later was kind of difficult to deal with, or they become too dependent on it. But one of the core design principles in this system is the fact that there are so many things like artifacts and ciphers that are constantly changing and refreshing. This counters that stagnation and makes the GM worry less about handing out some toys because there's a good chance they'll go away eventually. And that just means you as the GM get to hand out more toys. Character arcs are one of my favorite things in the Cypher system, and far more important than you'd think. These are basically personal storylines or quest lines that you plan on bringing your character through. Character arcs are meant to be entirely player-driven. The player decides on which character arc to use. The player decides when they attempt to achieve a step in the character arc. And the player talks to the GM when they think they have moved through the steps of the character arc for some XP rewards. Although the GM still monitors it and may have helps in guiding it, generally they're hands off and leave it up to the players for prompting it. Each character starts with a character arc of the player's choice. Starting new or additional character arcs cost 1 experience. A character can have multiple character arcs, although it's not suggested to have more than 2 or 3 at maximum. Character arcs are broken into parts: the opening, This is just what's needed to happen for the character arc to start. The steps, which are the individual steps of progress you make during the character arc. Each step earns the character 2 experience. How many steps there are isn't always clearly defined because it's really up to the consensus between the GM and player. This isn't even something you have to decide ahead of time. You could just complete steps until the GM and player think, it's close enough to resolve. Then there's the climax. This is the big moment where you figure out if the arc is considered successful or a failure. Success is 4 experience, with a failure still earning 2 experience. Keep in mind, there is one character arc that is impossible to succeed at, and that's by design. I'll let you figure out which one that is. Finally, the character arc has the resolution. This is the stage where you just sort of wrap things up and tidy any loose ends, and it gets you 1 experience. I find most people tend to use this experience point to help initiate the next character arc. Each part of the character arc is not meant to be completed quickly. A single step of a character arc could take you more than 1 session to complete. An entire character arc could easily span many sessions over the course of a campaign, depending how many steps are involved. Okay, we have covered all the main parts of the character sheet. Now let's start moving on to character creation and see what all of that is about. Now that we've covered what parts of a character are, let's start with how to put them all together in character creation. Creating your character is actually extremely straightforward. It just involves a lot of options. There are also a couple of ways to tackle creating a character. Some people prefer to write the information from their descriptor first. I personally like to go through my type first because it has the foundation for your basic stats. But there's no wrong answer. Everything turns out the same in the end. Also, I noticed a lot of people that use my tutorials or advice videos or watch my live streams or whatnot are not actually subscribed to the channel, so feel free to hit that button below. The extra numbers mean my videos get watched more. As my videos get watched more, I'm prompted and able to make more videos and focus on the channel that little bit more. So please, I would really appreciate it. Give that subscribe button a little bit of a press there and maybe a thumbs up as well. All right, let's continue. The first step is simple. We touched upon this already, actually, and that's filling out your character sentence with your descriptor, type, and focus, plus any extras your campaign might have, like racial descriptors, flavors, and so on. I want you to keep an open mind here if there's a curated list of what options you can take. I often refer to Cypher as a build-up system rather than a tear-down system. In games like Dungeons & Dragons, a lot of groups kind of assume that most of the options are open unless they've been restricted or unallowed. Cypher's a kind of the opposite, because this is a universal system, and there are many options that work in some scenarios, but not others. Nothing is getting restricted. Rather, the GM and group get together and often create a list of what is thematically appropriate for the game, building it up as a framework for you to work with. And if you don't want to create your own curated lists, Monica Games has done the legwork for you by having some suggested lists in the description of some of the more common genres like fantasy, sci-fi, fairy tale, modern, and so on. We need to figure out the basics of what your starting pools are. I suggest we begin looking at your character's type. Your type will let you know the starting amount for each pool, and you usually have 6 extra points to split among these pools as you wish. You could decide to put, say, 2 extra in each pool, or maybe 3, 2, and 1, or all 6 into a single pool. There's no limit to how high a pool can get, or how many points you can put into it. But just remember, the Cypher system isn't hyper-focused on one thing like combat. There's a very good chance that no matter what your character build is, you will likely use all 3 pools at various points. So feel free to try and min-max this as much as you want, but you're going to struggle in some areas pretty quickly if you only put everything into a single pool. Trust me. Next, we need to look at what we get for the first tier of play within your type. This will set up the rest of the basics for your character and what we can build off of. Firstly is the effort score, which we talked about previously. This will generally start at 1. Next is the modification to your edge. Much to my chagrin, this is actually named something different for each type, whether it's physical, nature, genius, or something else, but really it's just telling you that one of your edge scores is going to be set to 1 and the other 2 are set to 0. Then we have the number of ciphers you can have at any time, also known as your cipher limit. As I mentioned previously, there is a limit to the ciphers, and this is where you get that base limit for it. Then we have any starting equipment and weapons, which is usually appropriate clothing and how many items you get of each price category. It will also let you know which weapons you may have an inability with and which ones you're at least practiced in. This way you know which weapons you may want to pick up as extra gear if you want it. Remember that by default, Cypher is not that reliant on equipment for normal play. Generally, unless something is useful or interesting, you won't see a listing for it. However, there are some genres, especially survival horror, post-apocalyptic, etc., where equipment may be slightly more needed. Then we start with your first tier abilities. Your type will tell you to take from that list a certain number of times. If your group is using flavors as well, you can also swap out any of the entries to that type list with entries from your flavor list for you to choose from, modifying that list to your desire. Some of the abilities may provide you with training in skills, initiative, defenses, attacks, and other things entirely. Make sure to write these down as you get them for easy reference. Remember that Cypher does not have a set skill list, but rather has various levels of training for basically situations like positive social interactions or piloting a spaceship. The rest of the core character creation is smooth sailing because we're basically just writing down what we chose. Go through your descriptor and add anything the descriptor gives you to your character sheet, modifying any stats it says, taking any abilities it grants, etc. Then the same for your focus, which usually just grants one or more abilities, although very rarely I've also seen some foci even grant equipment. Then make sure you read over any modifiers or abilities carefully so you don't miss out on anything further down the line, but honestly this step's pretty easy. I touched upon character arcs earlier in the video and how important they can be to you and your character, as well as how they work. This is when you get to choose your first character arc, and it's totally free. You don't have to pay any experience to start it at character creation. Just remember that character arcs are player driven, so make sure you choose something that you personally want to delve into and drive forward in the story, because the GM is busy with the larger plotline of the campaign. Unlike other RPGs where everything you take is generally to make you better or more powerful, your choice of character arcs are sometimes more worthwhile if you choose something that's difficult to overcome or a struggle of some kind. This is because it will more likely have more steps to it for XP, but also generally because it'll be more memorable. I mean, think of starting with the birth character arc and dealing with being in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy in the middle of a survival horror campaign. That's intense stuff that makes you on the edge of your seat, like watching a movie. And finally, for character creation, depending on the campaign, its setting, what optional rules you're using, there might be some extras that you need to go over, like spells or power shifts, crafting mechanics, manifest aspects, and more. I can't cover everything here, so I'm just going to say that it's up to your game master to lead you through any extra options that have been added on. But it's also that at this point you kind of polish up the last few bits of your character sheet. Go back, tweak things, maybe choose a different ability if you decide, something like this. Experience points, or XP, in many RPG systems is used for one thing: character advancement. Cypher's not like that, partly because individual character advancement is not the focus of the game. The focus of the game is on discovery, exploration, exciting action, and advancing the story's plotline. Character advancement is something that may or may not happen during the course of this. So, firstly, how do you get experience points? Well, XP can be fed to you from several different routes. We've already talked about the fact that character arcs give you experience as you progress them. You may also gain them as GM awards when doing storylines that are not centered around your character arcs. These awarded experience points can come when making significant discoveries, accomplishing tasks, finding artifacts, or any other time it just sort of seems right to award it. The other experience comes from GM offering intrusions. We'll go over in detail how that works later. Once you have experience points, what can you do with them? Well, you can use experience for more immediate meta features, like re-rolling the dice for a task, refusing a GM intrusion, or proposing an intrusion of your own, also known as a player intrusion. These all cost 1 experience to do. There are some short and medium term benefits, like gaining a hyper-focused skill, like how to use a computer system but for only one particular building. In rare cases, a GM may also allow a character to gain a new ability for a short amount of time, usually the rest of the scene, although you may really have to explain why this would make sense. Either way, a short or medium term benefit is around 2 experience. Long-term benefits are often story-based things like gaining a new contact, getting ownership or access to a new building or area, being granted a new title or job, or increasing your personal wealth. These are usually 3 experience points to unlock. And finally, there's the character advancement itself. You will see on the character sheet here that there are 5 check boxes. Each one of these boxes costs 4 experience to check. Most of the boxes are pretty self-explanatory, adding to your pool's edge, effort, and training in a non-combat skill, which sets that skill to trained if you are practiced or had an ability, or to specialized if you were already trained. The other category has a few options which you can choose from. You get to choose one of these options. Things like reducing the cost for wearing armor, adding 2 to your recovery rolls, adding your alternate focus abilities from tier 3 and tier 6, and finally selecting another ability from your type. Once you have checked 4 out of the 5 boxes, you increase your tier by 1 and reset the advancement boxes. Increasing your tier is very easy. Your type will tell you how many new abilities you can choose from its list of that tier or earlier. It will often tell you that you may replace one of your lower tier abilities with another ability of also a lower tier. So if you were tier 3, you could replace one of your tier 2 abilities with another tier 2 or tier 1 ability, but not a tier 3 ability. Once you have those selected, you also gain abilities from your focus. At tiers 3 and 6, your focus will give you a choice between 2 abilities, of which you may only choose one for now. As a side note, some of these specific settings that utilize the Cypher system, the ones that basically predated the Cypher system as a standalone, will not always have dual abilities at tiers 3 and 6. So if you do not see a choice here at tiers 3 and 6, because you were playing those things, don't be wondering where they are, because they just aren't there. Player and GM intrusions, I think, are possibly one of the most important aspects of the Cypher system. It's a balancing tool that not many other RPG systems have, although I can think of a couple with something similar. If the narrative is going in a direction that someone does not want, or thinks should be changed, or feels like it's not balanced right, there's an in-game tool within Cypher that lets you balance or adjust it without feeling like you're cheesing things or cheating. In a game like Dungeons & Dragons, you need to very carefully plan out your encounters, conflicts, and scenes. If you don't, things may constantly either be too easy with no challenge to a group, or too hard, causing a devastating scenario where the entire group is wiped out. And the only way you can balance this mid-combat is kind of by modifying or cheesing some stats or rolls in the middle of the scene, which frankly does not feel great because that ruins the fact that it's a game with rules. And if you're just changing those things on the fly because of your whims and fancies, the players can get frustrated because they start to wonder why even bother with the game rules at all at that point if you're just going to change it depending on what you desire in that moment. The players lose their agency. The Cypher system solves all that. with intrusions. First, let's talk about how intrusions are introduced, then we'll talk about them in detail more. Intrusions can happen in one of a few ways. If a player rolls a natural 1 on a task roll, the GM gets a free intrusion on them. If a GM proposes an intrusion on a player, that player may spend 1 experience to refuse the intrusion, or if they accept it, they get 1 experience for themselves, and the player can choose a second player to also get 1 experience. Finally, players can propose player intrusions as well. If the GM accepts the intrusion being proposed, the player spends 1 or more experience, as decided by the GM, and the intrusion resolves. If the GM or group doesn't feel the intrusion is valid, then 0 experience is spent and nothing happens. So, what is an intrusion? An intrusion is a way to introduce a new narrative element. The GM could say something like 3 extra goblins join the fight to help balance what seemed like an easy conflict. Or, just as the villain is about to get defeated, you say, that wasn't even the villain's final form, and you add a whole new health pool. Maybe the boards break under your feet, causing your foot to get stuck in the floor, or any other number of things to influence, add, or subtract from the narrative. Players can do this as well, although their reach is meant to be a little smaller and more tempered here by default. Each character type actually has a list of example player intrusions to give you a rough guideline on the types of things they could achieve. But let players be creative with it and think outside of the box when doing this. Side note, in my games, I actually let my players go a little bigger on their intrusions because they like the fact that we can both influence the narrative in such drastic ways. But that's entirely a personal style decision and really depends on how confident you feel as a GM with your improv skills and adapting to these situations. Okay, there are some very important tips for intrusions I think you need to know when playing this game. Firstly, a GM intrusion should never, ever be used to counter a successful task. This isn't a you thought you won, but now you lose type of button. That's adversarial gameplay and does not make for a good experience. Instead, intrusions should be used to add drama or something of interest to the scenario. Maybe, for example, the player manages to reset the locking mechanism to the airlock successfully so that no one can get on their ship while they explore the space station. You decide to offer a GM intrusion that, although the lock is secure and worked perfectly, just like the player wanted, something went wrong in the mechanism and it broke, causing it to be stuck in that newly locked state. Uh-oh. Now the players can't get back to their ship this way either. They might have to do an EVA or find another way out there now. Drama. You notice this did not negate anything. They locked it. In fact, it almost made their check better than it was because now no one can unlock it. So you've just caused drama without negating what they can do. Another note is that GM intrusions do not have to be negative. You're not always there to make their lives a living hell, just when you want to. You're also there just to make things more interesting. In one of my recent games, I used a GM intrusion to state there was an open storefront for a particular pizza delivery chain in the area, despite the characters being in a totally strange, distant, and alien dimension. This did not negatively impact anyone. It did tie into the story and personality of a particular character I intruded upon, who was doing everything he could to distance himself from being a pizza delivery driver from this chain. It didn't hurt anyone, but it caused a real moment and added something of interest. So, that's intrusions, one of the greatest balancing mechanism you'll find in any RPG system. It lets the players do things that would feel like cheating in other systems. But it's okay, because the players still have agency. They can choose between a cost or a reward within the confines of the rules. How many times should the GM attempt to intrude? Well, there's no strict answer to that. It's suggested to try and intrude at least a few times over the course of a normal 3 to 4 hour session. Basically, it's whenever you feel it's appropriate to make things more interesting, or if you have the need to balance things out. You shouldn't feel pressure that you have to do it X number of times. There is no set number. One of the strengths of the Cypher system is that you can adjust it to be as narrative or as crunchy as you want. Distances within the system and how they work are no different. Do you want precise measurements and fancy maps? You can do that. Do you want abstract zones for rough distances in Theater of the Mind? Does that as well. And everything is designed with all of this in mind so that you can actually bounce back and forth between these without missing a beat. This is easily handled because basically everything in the system has one of the following ranges. Immediate. This is the distance you could reach if there were only a few steps away, or the size of maybe a small room. If you're looking for measurements, an immediate distance is 3 meters or 10 feet, and you can easily move an immediate distance as part of another action. Short. This is the area that might take you a moment to actually walk through. The measured distance is 15 meters or 50 feet. You can move a short distance as your entire action, or if you make a level 4 speed task, you can travel a short distance as part of another simple action like making an attack. Long. This might be a very large area, requiring everything you have to try and run across it during a single turn. The measured distance is 30 meters or 100 feet. If you want to clear this distance in a combat scenario, you will need to attempt a level 4 speed task, and it will take your entire action just to move it. Very long. This is getting too far and long for you to travel in a single round unless you have special abilities or vehicular assistance. You can easily fit an entire American-sized football field in this distance with plenty of extra room to spare. It's unlikely you'd see a single indoor space this size unless it was something truly epic. The measured distance is 150 meters or 500 feet long. And beyond. Any distance beyond very long is generally just given in measured distances, like kilometers, miles, parsecs, light years, and so on. Because of the fact that everything is handled in these range categories, you can easily switch back and forth between a more abstract description, saying like, oh, it's a moderate-sized room that's a short distance across, or that the Goblin Warband is a very long distance away. But you can also use precise measurements, saying that the cyborg is 10 meters away, which is within a short distance. Or you could even use a classic square or hex grid, with each block being 5 feet or 1.5 meters across. Just like you'd find in other more tactical RPGs. The range system in Cypher is great because you really can describe each scene in a way that best fits the narrative and your playstyle. Although I personally use mostly Theater of the Mind these days, I still switch it up and occasionally use some more precise measurements or even battle maps on my virtual tabletop. I want to talk about combat, but I think it's important to talk about NPCs and their stat blocks before we get there. NPCs in Cypher refers to anything the players don't control, like other people, monsters, robots, and more. There are sort of two ways stat blocks could work, a simplified version and something more filled out and robust. Let's start with a simple one, like this one for the black bear. As you can see, it's extremely small. In this case, it has a name and a level, which are the only two things you really need. But the black bear also has a modification where it attacks as a level 4 despite being a level 3 creature. The beauty of the way the simple stat blocks work is you could improvise something to act as opposition to the NPCs in literal seconds with basically no planning. So how does this work? Well, first of all, the fact that the NPC, in this case the black bear, has a level automatically tells you almost all the task rolls the players are going to be rolling against it. The black bear is a level 3, which means the target number is triple that, or 9 on a roll of 1d20. Although the black bear attacks as a level 4, so that means players would need to roll a 12 or higher when defending against its attacks. And just like all task rolls, effort, assets, training, and so on, the modifications on the creature can adjust the rolls against this level and target number. So that's 90% of the work done, right there, just with a simple level. Well, that's all well and good if it was a border guard you just needed to talk your way past, but what about combat? Well, there are two other really basic things you need for physical combat. It's health and how much damage it does. The Cypher System rulebook says that if nothing else is stated, then the default damage a creature deals with any attack is equal to its level. That's pretty easy. So a level 3 black bear would deal 3 damage, except that its stat block says it's treated as level 4 for attacks. So despite being a level 3 black bear, it would actually deal 4 damage. The rules say that an NPC's health is equal to its target number, and we know the target number is 3 times the level, so a level 3 black bear has 9 health by default. Now remember, this is just the default for the listing that doesn't have these numbers filled out. You are fully expected to tweak these numbers as needed for creating an engaging and memorable encounter. I'll have a link in the description below to a handy guide on the Canuck website for when to tweak certain numbers and more tips on creating NPCs very quickly. Okay, that gets those micro stat blocks out of the way, but what about the full-sized ones you might see in the bestiaries? Let's take a look at the Fallen Angel stat block to delve a little deeper. The first things you see at the top is the name and the level with its target number in brackets. So even if you were missing chunks of the stat block, honestly you could still get the general feel of how much of a challenge this creature will be just from this line alone. Rolling a 15 on a d20 if you have no way to modify it just to affect this creature is no joke. Under the top bar, you get a narrative description. Some of the books may have a picture floating around as well. I'm using the stat block from the free system reference document here that anyone can use. Next, we have motive. This is simple, usually just a word or maybe a sentence to give a brief rundown of why this NPC does what it does. Then we have environment. Where are you likely to find this type of NPC? Next is health. As you can see from the health of the Fallen Angel, it does not follow the listed health equals target number default. This is because the defaults I gave previously are only for very basic guidelines for when you have no other information for what are supposed to be basic NPCs. Remember, Cypher fully supports you tweaking and adjusting things. If most of the players are lower in tier, then 25 could be a nice and lengthy encounter. But if all the PCs are like tier 5 or 6, then unless you plan on this being just a quickie encounter, you're probably going to want to pad the health of this NPC stat block, increase its level, or even have multiple of them in a group. Then we do damage for the creature. This is the basic damage they do with anything. A punch, gun, lead pipe, power blast, you name it. If there's not a special damage listed in the combat area, then this is the damage you use for the creature. If a creature has armor, it will be listed here. Otherwise, it just won't be in the stat block. Armor generally refers to physical damage like attacks, unless it says otherwise or the GM says so. For the Fallen Angel, I'd say it represents a supernatural resistance to physical attacks, but that radiation from nuclear fallout would probably still do some pretty terrible things to it, bypassing this armor. But hey, maybe yours are awesome mutant post-apocalyptic toxic wasteland Fallen Angels. What do I know? We then have the movement of a creature. If they spend their turn moving, this is how far they can go. Generally, if you as the GM want them to do an action and move, they can move one category less than this amount. So if it says short, that means they could either move short or move an immediate distance and take an action. Depending on the setup of your game, if they're meant to be a little beefier, you could play it that their movement is how far they can travel and still take an action. It's Cypher. Customize it how you want. Next is modifications. Basically, these are situations where the creature is treated as a different level than normal. So the Fallen Angel is normally level 5 for everything. Except at night, it's treated as level 7 for perceptions and attacks. Whew. You want to fight this thing on the day shift. Then we have combat. This is where one or more paragraphs describing any special abilities, attacks, tactics, resistances, and so on the creature may use in a combat scene. Then there is interaction. This is a brief guideline or helpful description of what is likely going to happen if the PCs try to interact with it in a more complex manner than just smacking it in the face. For this Fallen Angel, it says the PCs may be able to talk to it in the daytime, but at night, all bets are off, because the angel has basically gone knucking futs. Next is the use. If you don't know how to introduce the creature to your game for one reason or another, this is a brief, helpful description of how to insert it, or possibly why it shows up or is there. Great for when you absolutely need a certain creature, but you're not sure exactly how you want to bring it in. Loot. Not all stat blocks have a loot section. like Armour, it may or may not be there. In fact, many of the stat blocks do not have a loot section. But if a creature has any suggested equipment, artifacts, ciphers, materials, or more that the players could gain, there will be a loot section here. Finally, there will be a GM intrusion suggestion. In this Old Gus SRD, it's in the box underneath it. In the books, you usually find it in that side column that you find in Cypher books. The GM intrusion is just an extra suggestion if you're having a hard time coming up with some of your own. These are always tailored to the creature. And there we have it. That's the quote-unquote complex NPC stat blocks. Although when you really boil it down, it's still kind of streamlined and simple to understand. Number-wise, there's not a lot that's needed. Most of this is actually just like narrative suggestions. You don't need charts of numbers, special subsystems for certain categories of abilities, or special resource tracking. Cypher just makes sure that running the game is super easy. The GM should be more focused on thinking about pacing and how to guide the story and not have to worry about a billion little rules getting in the way. NPC stat blocks being so very simple is a way to help in that. One last note I want to make before moving on. If you want to find what book a certain creature is in, as well as maybe get the basics of that creature like its level and where you'd find it, or maybe filter creatures by these things, on top of the NPC stat blocks in the open license you can find on the handy SRD, Monty Cook Games has provided us with a complete creature index of basically every creature they've ever published in any of their books. It doesn't provide you all of the details, but it gives you a name, a brief description, a level, what genres it's likely to fall into, environment, motivation, and what sources or card decks you'll find it in. Nice and easy to search. I'll put a link for this below in the description. And did I just mention card decks? Yes, Monty Cook Games has card decks for quick stat blocks as well, which is pretty cool. They make card decks for a lot of things, actually. So you'll probably want to check out their store for intrusion decks, NPC stat blocks, and more. It really helps with the game. Combat is a very streamlined and straightforward process in Cypher. You're not going to get all the confusing different types of actions like in D&D and those odd interactions that come with them. Really, it goes like this. When combat begins, the GM decides which NPCs are in the combat. The players roll a speed task. This is modified by any training and initiative, plus abilities, assets, effort, etc. It's the same as any other task. Cypher doesn't exactly have an initiative order by default. Instead, a PC takes their turn after any creature they failed against, but before any that they succeeded against for their initiative tasks. So, for example, let's say the PCs are facing off against a level 2 orc with a target number of 6, and a level 4 super orc with a target number of 12. We have 4 PCs, A, B, C, and D, that rolled a 15, 9, 7, and 4. So they would be inserted into the initiative like this. It's at this point you'll see the different GMs handle this slightly differently. Some organize the players into specific initiative orders depending on how well they rolled, so they would handle the turns in the orders you see here. If you're playing on a virtual tabletop, it's not uncommon to see this method used, just because the virtual tabletop probably automatically does it for you. However, if you're playing in person, many GMs just use the book suggestion and treat them as groups, where the players in the groups get to determine who goes first. As an example for this method, you could see player A would go, then the level 4 super orc, then players B and C go in whichever order they wanted, then the level 2 orc, then player D. After that, it just falls into taking the actions you want to take, and the players roll their task rolls. Remember, players make all of the rolls in the game, so whether they're attacking, defending, or something else entirely, it's the player doing the roll. Other than that, there are suggested actions a player can take, such as attacking, guard, help, use an ability, ciphers, and all the ones you'd expect. Although read carefully, because there are a few you don't see in D&D, like take the attack, where you can basically scream, "Get down, Mr. President!" President, and jump in front, taking it for your buddy. Or draw the attack, where you can hop around like a wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man to try and get a creature to focus on you instead of something else. Then you just need to do the needful until the GM and group are satisfied that the scene is resolved. That may involve killing all the bad guys, but that could just as easily be scaring them off, convincing them not to fight you, or a different resolution entirely. I had a session where the players defeated the big boss encounter by talking about canoes until the boss got so flustered and confused it just wandered away. They didn't attack it even once. Remember, combat is not the focus in Cypher unless you really want it to be. They don't get any experience or benefits from combat specifically, and unless it's part of a specific task to say go kill 5,000 boars in the forest, PCs might actually be better off avoiding combats when they can, especially if it's a combat that looks like it would be excessively difficult or draining on resources. After all, a level 7 Cyclops means they need to roll a 21 on a 20-sided die for every task roll, something that's impossible without training, assets, resources, tactics, and more. Could they attempt it at tier 1? Sure, it's even possible with the right teamwork and planning, maybe a little luck, but it's pretty much draining yourself dry to use effort on every bloody roll. It would be a close one, and there's real chance that death would occur, and the whole situation could go south pretty quickly. So what's a little easier than making dozens of level 7 task rolls to fighting a Cyclops? How about a single task roll needed to sneak past that level 7 Cyclops, basically working around the combat? I know it's weird I'm giving examples of ways to stop combat from happening in the section about combat, but I wanted to really portray the fact that, unless it's the play style you're going for, in Cypher it's not all about bad guys appear, combat start, you punch faces till bad guys are dead, rinse and repeat. With the game being so easy to modify, improv, and create for the GM, there's no reason you have to fall into the trap that other systems have. Systems that make combat filler content. Instead, combat can have a reason where it occurs that makes it cinematic and interesting, something the systems who only really have combat rules have a hard time with. So don't be afraid to play things open-ended in a possible combat scenario. Be creative, find new and interesting ways to resolve these conflicts, or even a way around them. Okay, this will have been my longest Cypher video that isn't a live stream or actual play. Like, longest, by far. So far, I'd say we've covered everything you need to know for the basics to play the Cypher system. Honestly, except for character options and lists of things like ciphers, artifacts, and equipment, you could probably run the entire game with pretty much what I've just told you. There are other things I want to say. Tips on how to run the game, suggestions for when to do the things for the maximum fun, touch upon optional rules and subsystems, as well as those dials and knobs to customize everything. Basically, stuff that expands upon everything. But I think that needs to be in another video. Otherwise, you're just going to get a 10-hour-long video after not hearing from me for a month. So I'm going to call it here. I've spent far too long writing, recording, and editing this bloody thing. Have I forgotten anything as far as the basics go? Or maybe got something wrong? Oh, probably. My smooth brain can only hold so much information, but that's okay. I'm like 87% human, and I do normal human things, like making mistakes. So if you find anything, feel free to post it in the comments below so that people know I screwed up. I'll try to read your comments through the tears as I ugly cry at my computer desk. I hope this video has been helpful. If you want to throw a couple of bucks for this Canuck so I can try to keep pretending to actually make money on YouTube and maybe get a couple of brewskis in the process, I'd appreciate you clicking on the Ko-fi link below and tossing a few my way. If you can afford it, of course. Alrighty, as always, stay healthy, stay safe, and have a good one, eh?